I think I will begin.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, so I would first of all, I want to welcome everybody who has tuned in to the 29th commemoration of the passing of HaGaon Rav Avraham Aharon Price Yahrtzeit v'Kadosh Livracha. And Rabbi Price's accomplishments are well known by the group that has tuned in. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, and he possesses an awe-inspiring resume from both the secular and religious worlds. He received his smicha from Ner Israel Yeshiva in Baltimore in 1976, and I believe a doctorate also in Talmudic law from the same yeshiva in 1992, where he's a very close student, I think, of Rabbi Ruderman and Rabbi Weinberg. He also graduated in 1979 from Harvard Law School, summa cum laude, an interesting combination. He served as a rabbi in the Woodside Synagogue in Silver Spring, Maryland, for 22 years, until he decided to make Aliyah in 2010. Since making Aliyah, Rabbi Breitowitz has served as a senior lecturer at the Yeshivat Or Sameach and as the rabbi of the Kilat Or Sameach. He has written extensively on medical, business, family, and legal ethics. He has authored a book, Between Religious and Secular Law, The Plight of the Aguna. He has practiced law in Chicago, and he has served on the faculties of law at the universities of Illinois and at the University of Maryland. I had the privilege of attending Shiurim by Rabbi Breitowitz last winter in Yerushalayim, and I can testify that while Rabbi Breitowitz has obviously ascended to a very elevated sphere of, we'll say, rabbinic and intellectual brilliance, he maintains that ability to connect and communicate with consideration and kindness to the average person who comes to him to seek his guidance. With that, I will give you Rabbi Breitowitz.
Thank you very much, Dr. Silverberg. It's a great honor to be able to address people in Toronto on this Yahrtzeit of really one of the great Gaonim of North America, Rav Avraham Aharon Price, Zechreino Livracha. I'm not going to go over his biography in great detail. I assume that all of you are familiar, and you obviously knew Rabbi Price much better than I did. I was not so good to know him personally, but I could see from his life story what an exceptional person he must have been, coming to the Avnei Nezer at the young age of around 10 years old, and then moving to Berlin, being a banker at the same time, finishing Shas and learning with Rav Chaim Heller, and then moving to Paris, and then finally coming to Toronto. I think it was in 1937, where for more than 57 years, he was zocheh to be both Rosh Yeshiva and Chief Rabbi of Toronto. Besides his many sforim, which are quite, again, being a congregational rabbi, I know how hard it is to be a rabbi and write at the same time. But Rav Price, many of you know, wrote 2 volumes of drushos called Imrei Avraham, and then his other svarim are called Mishnas Avraham. He has 3 volumes on what was then a newly discovered manuscript of Sefer Hasidim, and then 2 volumes of different Kiddushin on many mitzvos HaTorah, and then finally a work that is still in the process of coming out, but 4 volumes have come out on the Smag, Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol, which is really an excuse to write on Kol HaTorah Kula, because the Smag covers all of the 613 mitzvahs. Again, in reading some of these forum, I came across a tremendous ga'inus. It reminds me a little bit of a sarcastic remark that was made by Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who I guess Rabbi Price might have known because they were in Berlin at the same time. Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg was a graduate of Slobodka. He was very close to the elder of Slobodka, but he left Lithuania and he spent a number of years in Germany, where he eventually became director of the Hildesheimer Academy. And then later, World War II, he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he really got to know Gedolim in 3 different countries: the Lithuanian Gedolim of what we call the Yeshiva world, and then the Hasidic Peilische Gedolim, in Galicia and Poland, from where Rabbi Price comes, and then some of the German Talmidei Chachamim as well. And Rabbi Price once, Rabbi Weinberg once remarked, it was much harder to be a Polish Gadol than a Litvish Gadol. Again, this is a little sarcastic. A Litvish Gadol simply had to have a good head with svara, but didn't have to know a lot. Because, you take one Rambam and you're mafalpa. But a Polish Gadol had to bring from Kala Torah Kula. And I'll tell you the truth, as I read Rav Price's svarim, I get that sense tremendously. He was a person who was not only very acute in svara, but everything was mevusas, everything was based on Yerushalmis, and I can see that, how knowledgeable was in Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi, Tosefta, Shelas and Shuvas, like the Ribosh and the Tashbats, an amazing thing, meaning he just wasn't someone who took one little Rambam and would give svaras for it, but someone who really had such a hekif. I know that he was a bibliophile with the huge Svarim collection, but he wasn't just a book collector. He knew the Svarim in the library. He learned the Svarim in the library, and he was able to draw upon it in Shelas Utshuvas and Chidushei Torah. So again, it's quite astounding. And what's amazing is that in the Mishnat Avraham Kiddushin, he writes that he's going to go very light on the pilpul because he knows it may confuse people. He says, even though he's quite skilled in it, he's going to go very light. Well, all I can tell you is, if what I read is an example of going light, I mean, I was focusing on some of his Torah for a few weeks now. And, I'm finally getting to hopefully trying to understand it a little bit better. If he would have been a little tougher, as he said he was capable of doing, I think I would have been totally lost. So tremendous kindness, and what a zechus Toronto had to be able to have such a great person for so many years, for more than 50 years. I know that he was very, very instrumental in the expansion of the HaRav. I also know there's controversy regarding the HaRav, but all I can tell you is that bein kach ubein kach, everything was mavusas on rayos, on precedent, on svara. This was not someone who just acted by the seat of his pants. So Kedarka Shel Torah, there are machloksim in halacha. That's always the case. But he was somebody who knew what he was talking about, and you had to take whatever position he took very, very, very seriously. In addition to being a Rosh Hashiva, a Mechaber, and a Rav, he had a tremendous role in displaced persons coming into Canada. A tremendous chesed of, I think, over 100 people were able to come to Canada because of his tremendous efforts. So again, Yehi Zichrei Baruch, obviously, he had the talent and he had the mind to become anything. I'm sure he would have been superb in any type of business career. He had a business career before he came to Toronto, and yet he devoted his life to Torah, Ziko Herabim. So quite unusual, quite unusual in the light. So I just want to point out a few things. In his drushos, he often talked about the role of a Rav. And I was not zocheh to know him, but you can get a sense of personality, maybe I'm totally wrong, from his writings. And I see that he seemed to have a certain acerbic wit. He was quite critical of the modern rabbi as being too focused on entertainment rather than erudition. And he said, it's good to be Me'urav ben Abrios and to tell nice stories, but ultimately the Rav has to be a posek and has to be a chashuv talmid chacham in Torah. And when the rabbi becomes too much of an entertainer, he might be compromising his position. And in several of the drushos, he made that point about what he called the yerida of the Rabbanos in America. I also want to add, too, that Baruch Hashem, my brother, of course, in Toronto, Rabbi Eliezer, so that's one Toronto connection I have. I also want to add, though, that I understand that Rav Moshe Hachman, Shlita, was very, very instrumental in preparing the Ksavim over the years for publication. And Rabbi Hachman and I both grew up in Hartford, Connecticut. And Rav Hachman was the Elterer Bacher that used to inspire us when we were kids. And for me, one of my first understandings of Lumdus is when Rav Moshe would come to Hartford from Ner Yisrael, Bein Azmanim, and he would show us the Simcha of Torah and the Amkus of Torah. And that's something that I'm very, very grateful for. So I'm very glad that we're kind of sharing this memorial of Rav Price, he in terms of preparing the Ksavim, and I in terms of giving a little bit of a talk on one of his Kiddushin. I also want to point out another Baltimore-Toronto connection, and that is there was a great, almost unknown gadol in Baltimore, Rav Michael Forschlander, who was mamish a baki in Kol HaTorah Kula, but kind of was almost unknown outside of the few people that knew who he was. And he was Rav Price's mentor. He was the elder person. He was older than Rav Price as a Talmud of the Avnei Nezer. And I came across some letters, correspondence between Rav Price and Rav Forschlander, in which Rav Forschlander said he considered Rav Price to be his son, as good as his son in terms of how proud he was of all of his accomplishments in Torah and how much pleasure he got from reading the Kiddushin of Rav Price. And I think Rav Price considered Rav Forschlander to be kind of a father Rebbe type of figure. So that's also going to be Baltimore-Toronto connection. I do want to apologize for the false advertising. I think the advertising said I would say something from Chelik Dalet of the Smag, but after looking through things, I actually want to say something from Chelik Aleph of Mishnas Avram, which are the Chidushim. And in particular, I apologize for the false advertising. And this is a very, very lengthy kuntris of 22 pages. And the pages are very, very dense, dealing with the topic called Kiddushay Arkaot, which essentially means the status of civil marriages. Do civil marriages require a get upon their dissolution? This was and is still a very, very major issue. Rav Price wrote a kuntris in Mishnas Avram Aleph of 22 pages, and he wrote a rejoinder to various hasagos that other gedolim gave him in Mishnas Avram Chelik Beis of 12 pages. And once again, the tremendous erudition is very, very clear. What's fascinating is that the 22-page kuntris was written while he was still in Paris. So he informs us. Now, he left Paris at the age of 37. So I don't know. So this was written before the age of 37. And all I can tell you is it is a magnificent example of Gainus. You see, even at that age, well before he was even officially a Rav, this is while he was in the banking business, what a great Talmud Chacham he is. In some ways, as we prepare for Shavuos, this is an important mussar for us, that even if we're in the working world, there's still going to be an achrayas that we have to learn as much as we can, because here you have a person who was in the working world, who managed to achieve what he's able to achieve. So basically, this was a kuntris that was a response to an earlier tshuva that was written by Rabbi Cheskel Avramsky, who was a Talmud of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, and Rabbi Cheskel Avramsky at the time was the Av Basin of London, was the famous head of the London Basin. And Rav Avramsky wrote a long tshuva in which he maintained that civil marriages, by definition, have no validity simply because it's not a Maisa Kiddushin. There was no giving of a ring or value from the chassan to the kala. You didn't have kosher witnesses. There was no particular amira, declaration of hareyat mekudeshetli. So the Maisa Kiddushin was a nullity. There was no Maisa Kiddushin. Rabbi Cheskel Avramsky said, if there's no Maisa Kiddushin, then even if they live together, even if they cohabit together, no marriage can be formed when the initial Maisa was not a valid Maisa Kiddushin. Therefore, civil marriages. Now, again, please note at the outset that we're not yet talking about conservative reform. We'll see if it's the same or not, but at least purely civil marriages do not need a get. Rav Price took a much stricter view, and Rav Price developed a very intriguing thesis in which, to use in modern legal terms, Rav Price said Halachah recognizes what might be called a common law marriage. Let me explain the legal term for a moment. Again, I'm a little ignorant of the laws of Canada, so I may not be saying anything that's Canadian law. But generally speaking, if you look at marriage from a secular standpoint, so there are certain requirements for marriage. You got to have a marriage license, etc. And if you don't have a marriage license, you're not legally married. Nevertheless, in the United States, in some states, if a man and woman live together as husband and wife, and they are known in the community as husband and wife, their non-existent marriage status morphs into a marriage, afal pi, that they don't have a marriage license and they didn't comply with the formalities of the ceremony. Now, not all states recognize this, but some states do. And this is the phrase in legal analysis that is called a common law marriage. So there is a statutory marriage where you follow the formalities. And then there is a common law marriage, which arises out of the cohabitation and living together of a man and a woman who are specifically representing themselves to be husband and wife. Rav Price, without using legal categories, but Rav Price, through different rayos, basically said, Halachah lahavdil works exactly the same way. There is something called a Maaseh Kiddushin, in which there is Kiddushin in front of witnesses, designated witnesses, but then there is something called Ishus, that when a man and a woman live together b'derech Ishus, this creates a marital bond, even though there's no Maaseh Kiddushin. Now, I want to be very, very emphatic that one way of looking at it is not the way Rav Price is looking at it. That's one person might say, well, wait a second. Why don't you just say that the reason why it's a marriage is because the Mishnah says in Kiddushin, you can do Kiddushin in three ways. Kesef, by giving money or money's value, which is a ring. Shtar, which we don't do today, but by giving a shtar that you're my wife. Or bia. You can do a Maaseh Kiddushin with bia, and bia is a way of doing Kiddushin. Although Rav gave malchus to people who did that, it was not considered tznius because you're having intercourse with a woman you're not married with. But l'maaseh, you can do that. Now, it's important to note, Rav Price is not saying, okay, he's saying a different thought. Rav Price is not saying, since they're living together, it becomes a Maaseh Kiddushin of bia. Some do understand it that way, that it's Kiddushay bia. He does not say it's Kiddushay bia because he points out that in many ways, just cohabiting l'shem ishus would not necessarily be a Kiddushay bia, because Kiddushay bia, number one, requires that you're meyached, you designate witnesses, not to see the intercourse, but at least for yichud, you designate them outside the room as edei yichud, which is part of why Rav didn't like this idea. And number two, if you weren't meyached, if a lot of people know, and some of them are karov or puzzle, there's a general rule that in terms of hilchos edus, if any one of a large group is karov or puzzle, the whole thing is no good, which is why by Kiddushin we're miyached. Now here, if you're creating a marriage based on the public representation that they are living as husband and wife, it really cannot work as Kiddushay bia, Maaseh Kiddushin, although some do describe it that way. But Rav Price is saying a much bigger chiddush. It's not working mitam Kiddushin, it is working mitam what he calls ishus. There is marriage through Kiddushin, and there is marriage through ishus, and which again, I think common law marriage is absolutely the closest analogy to this. And in Kiddushin, not Kiddushin, but in marriage through ishus, you do require public knowledge, but we don't have the rule that you have to be miyached edim, and we don't have the rule of karov v'pasol edusan batela, because it is not marriage through a Maaseh Kiddushin, it's marriage through the relationship of ishus, that you're maintaining a home of husband and wife. And again, he brings from the Tashbetz, one of the great Chuvas, early Aharon, in which the Tashbetz talks about marriage as having two components. There is marriage as Kiddushin, there's Hektish, right? The man makes the woman like something holy, Ha'ish Mekadesh. And then there is marriage as Kinyan, as acquisition. I know it's not a politically correct term, but at least acquisition in the sense that the woman is excluded from marrying somebody else. So he points out that when you have a Maisa Kiddushin, you have both the Kiddushin, the Hektish, and the Kinyan. And that's why the Mishnah in Kiddushin uses different phrases. Ha'ish Mekadesh, Ha'isha Niknes. But when you have Ishus without Kiddushin, you still have Kinyan, even though you don't have Kiddushin, Kiddusha rather. And therefore he maintains that the Kinyan alone would be Mechayev a get for dissolution, because the Kinyan of the husband over the wife in terms of excluding her to other people, even if it doesn't have a tzad Kiddusha, is enough to be Mechayev regard. Again, I do want to point out, forgive me for repeating it, this is not simply making the statement that this is Kiddushay Bia. Because if you could characterize it as Kiddushay Bia, then it would mamish be a Maisa Kiddushin. Rav Price's point is that even if it's not Kiddushay Bia, it creates a relationship of Ishus. Now, this immediately raises a certain problem. So according to Rav Price, if a man and a woman are living together as husband and wife, and there was no Maisa Kiddushin, that is called a marriage. Now the question is, isn't that what a pilegesh? Pilegesh is a term that's used in the Chumash, used in Nach. A pilegesh is translated as a concubine or a mistress. And a pilegesh is described as below Kiddushin. It's a machlokas. Some say there is Kiddushin without a ksuba, but the Gersa of the Rambam is, and the Ravid both is, that there's no Kiddushin and there's no ksuba, but she's miyuchedet, meaning it's not a prostitute relationship where she goes to everybody, but she's my mistress. She's only with me. Now, the Chayra, Rav Price immediately has to deal with this problem, because it's absolutely clear that a pilegesh does not need a get. A pilegesh, the Rambam says. Now, there's a machlokas. First of all, is the pilegesh mutter? The pilegesh, some say, the Rambam says, is only mutter to a melech. A hedjot cannot have a pilegesh. That's the Shitas of Rambam. There's a famous tshuva of Rav Yaakov Emden, maybe I shouldn't say publicly, in which he says a pilegesh is mutter even lahedjet. But bein kach u bein kach, the definition of a pilegesh is a woman that is miyuchedet, to have a relationship exclusively with a man, but because there's no Kiddushin, you don't need a get, right? That's the Halachah. That pilegesh does not need a get. That's a davar pashut. But according to Rav Price, if the pshat is living together as husband and wife, even without a Maisa Kiddushin, creates an ishus, then why wouldn't a pilegesh become your wife? So Rav Price basically says, yeah, this is his diak. Taisa, the question is, it says a pilegesh is without Kiddushin and without Kesuva. Now, the Chayra, why do you say without Kesuva? If it's without Kiddushin, of course there's no Kesuva. So Rav Price ingeniously said, these are two alternative conditions. Without Kiddushin, she is a pilegesh. I'm sorry, not alternative, meaning you need two conditions. But if it would be without Kiddushin, but there would be a kesuva, she wouldn't be a pilegesh. Meaning, in order to be a pilegesh, it has to be without Kiddushin and without kesuva. So he interprets kesuva to mean the assumption of the obligations of a husband to a wife, meaning this is goof of the board, that even if there's no Kiddushin, if he assumes the obligations of husband to wife, it's going to turn into ishus. Very interesting chiddush, that a pilegesh is a pilegesh because none of the obligations of a husband to a wife were assumed. Masha Enkein, he says, in a civil marriage, where the husband agrees to support his wife, etc., that would qualify as a kesuva without a Kiddushin. And a kesuva without a Kiddushin is not a pilegesh, Now, he's mesupik. Are you allowed to have that relationship? Could very well be you're not allowed to have that relationship, even though it's not a pilegesh, even though it's ishus, because you have to do it derech Kiddushin. Okay? But even if you're not allowed, you would still need a get. In other words, he's interpreting the word kesuva not to refer to our kesuva, but to the obligations of husband and wife. Again, Rabbi Cheskel Avramsky, who himself was quite a great gadol, in fact, he was actually much older than Rav Price, did take the position that a civil marriage woman is nothing more than a pilegesh at best. But Rav Price says no, because of the assumption of obligation as well as cohabitation. There is a marriage b'tayras ishus, even if there's not a marriage b'tayras kedushin. And as I say, that would be tantamount to a halachic common law marriage. So again, it's a very, very, very fascinating issue. And he goes through Rav Avramsky's rayas and he tries to shlug them up. As far as you know, Rav Avramsky did not respond to this. But interestingly, the first Sephardic chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, Rav Meir ben Sion Chai Uziel, who was a big Talmud Chacham, did read Rav Price's tshuva and was very, very angry. Very, very upset. And he wrote a long attack on Rav Price's psak. He said it's a double patra, you don't need to get. And Rav Price wrote a response back to that. And that is what you find in Mishnas Avram Chelek Beis. And in fact, what's interesting is the first thing that Rav Uziel attacked was the title. I talk about not giving you any leeway. He attacked the title of the essay. Rav Price's tshuva was called Kiddushay Arkaot. That means the Kiddushin in a civil court. And he says, how can you possibly use the word Kiddushin for a secular court proceeding? You're degrading the idea of holiness. The correct term is Nisue Arkos, not Kiddushay Arkos. And Rav Uziel spent around a page just attacking the use of that term. And Rav Price spent a page and a half saying, number one, he apologizes for using the term, but after all, a name is just a name, and one shouldn't make a big issue. He then has a little bit of a shtach to Rav Uziel, where he says that now he understands the Gemara. The Gemara says that the Talmidei Chachamim of Eretz Yisrael have so much derech eretz to their colleagues. So Rav Price was medayik. They have derech eretz to their colleagues in Eretz Yisrael, but to a Rav in Chutz La'aretz, they don't have that type of respect. But he said anyway that he would have kept quiet on the whole issue, but since this is nogeya the nisur of Eishes Ish, if a woman doesn't get a get and she needs a get, it's mamish and aveira daraisa of Eishes Ish, which very serious repercussions. So Rav Price said he had a chiyuv to articulate his position because of the chaimer of the aveira that is involved. But so there is kind of a long response to Rav Uziel, who maintains that any ishus that exists without Kiddushin, she is a pilegesh at best. So number one, it's asur lahedjet to have a pilegesh, okay. But number two, a pilegesh does not need a get. So it's both prohibited, which Rav Price might agree to as well, but you don't need a get. Now, let me point out, though, that Rav Price has a number of rayas, and some of the rayas are complicated. We're not really able to go over all of the rayas, but I'll just mention a few of the basic texts. One is a Mishnah at the end of Maseches Gittin that says, "Hamagaresh es ishtay." A person gave his wife a get. They're not married anymore. He gave her a get, and then they spent the night in a hotel room. Lana ima b'pundiki. Now we don't even know if they had relations, but the assumption is they're in a hotel room. They had relations. According to Beis Hillel, the woman needs a get from her husband. Now the question is, why would the woman need a get from her husband? So the Gemara says, Ein Adam, according to Beis Hillel, Ein Adam Baya Isa Bilasa Bilasnus. We assume, number one, they had intercourse. And number two, once he has intercourse, he is not having intercourse for promiscuous reasons. He is having intercourse to reestablish a marital bond. And therefore, she needs a get. This is at least Beis Hillel's opinion. And the question is, where are the witnesses? Where are the witnesses? Elamai, the fact that the public just knows they were together that night creates what is called a marriage derech ishur through ein adam isa bilasa bilasnus, even though it's not derech Kiddushin, and even though Beis Shammai argues, but okay, so what? In the machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the halacha is very much like Beis Hillel. So this idea of ein adam isa bilasa bilasnus is the foundation, essentially, of the principle that something can morph, that even though there was no Maaseh Kiddushin, it can morph into a marriage. And Rabbi Price points out in Maseches Kesuvos, the Gemara has a number of other cases where we apply the rule of Ein Adam Eiseh Bilas Shenus. For example, remember in the time of the Gemara, in the time of the Chumash, there used to be erusin, not the modern Hebrew of an engagement, but literally the Kiddushin would be done and they would not consummate the marriage till a year later. So let's assume a person was makadesh a woman on a condition. In other words, harayat, we don't do that today, but harayat mekudeshet li, only if your father gives me $1,000. And the father did not give $1,000, but the husband consummated the marriage anyway. So according to Rav, which we paskin like, even though the Kiddushin was on condition, the consummation of the marriage is in effect a waiver of the condition, because he wouldn't want to have a bilas nus, because if he would be boel only if the condition would be fulfilled, he would be taking the risk that this would be a promiscuous intercourse. And since a person does not want, we assume, a promiscuous intercourse, he's boel l'shem kiddushin. Where are your witnesses? You weren't miyached. So again, Rabbi Price is learning this is an example of a marriage through derech ishus, even if it did not comply with the rules of a Maaseh Kiddushin. So the Gemara uses it by the case of a Tanai and the like. So we have these two texts, the Mishnah at the end of Gittin, where Hamagarish Esishtei V'lana Ima B'Pundiki, and Makadesh al Hatanai. And he brings various sources that support this construction, that in marriage there are two elements. There is the hektish and the kinyan, and even if the Maaseh Kiddushin does hektish and kinyan, the ishus, living beishus, can create the kinyan even without the hektish, and that's enough to be mechayev again. So after going through all the rayas now, Rav Price, Kedarka Shel Torah, goes over all of the proofs that go to the opposite direction and tries to see if they could be reconciled with his particular approach. He brings a tshuva of the Rivash. And this, I think, will introduce a major qualification into his analysis. And he spends quite a few pages doing this. He brings both from the Rivash and he brings from Tshuvos Binyamin Ze'ev. Rabbi Binyamin Ze'ev was at the time of Rav Yosef Karo. In fact, it's one of the few Shelos Tshuvos that the Yosef Karo does not quote because it was coming out the same time as the Beit Yosef. And in both the Rivash and the Binyamin Ze'ev, we see that something a little bit similar to a civil marriage did not require a get. The case of the Rivash involved a situation of forced conversion, where Jews were under pressure to either convert to Christianity or to Islam, and they had a marriage under the church or under the under Islam. Different shuvas are dealing with Christianity and Islam, and later they continued to live together as husband and wife. And the Rivash paskins that since the Maisa of marriage was not valid, it was a church marriage, it was not Kedas Moshe B'Yisrael, there is no need for a get. This is the Rivash Siman Vav, and L'chaira, Rav Price says, L'chaira, you might, in fact, Rav Yecheskel Avramsky brings this Rivash, and Rav Yecheskel Avramsky says that's a clear raya that when you don't have a valid Maisa Kiddushin, cohabitation later does not turn into a marriage derech ishus, because the Rivash says you do not need a get at all. Shelas Atshuvas Binyamin Ze'ev says the same thing. So here, Rav Price comes up with a very, very, very crucial distinction. He says there is a difference between people who didn't have a marriage ceremony and simply lived together as husband and wife versus people that have a marriage ceremony that's halachically invalid. And he says, when they've gone through a marriage ceremony and they think, because of their mistaken minds, that that marriage ceremony solemnized their marriage, then all of the intercourse and relations they have later is not for the purpose of creating a marital bond. It is simply, we're doing it because we're already married. This is called Aldas Kiddushin Rishonim. So Rav Price says, in a situation where there was an invalid marriage that they believe is a valid marriage, at that point, even with the principle of Ein Adam Ha'isa Bilasa Bilasanot, they're not bayel l'shem Kiddushin or l'shem ishus. They're bayel because they think they're already married because of the earlier ceremony. And therefore, there's a chiluk between registering with civil authorities versus having a church wedding or the like. Now, I have to admit, I'm not sure I fully grasp this distinction, because in civil marriage as well, as far as I understand, there is some ceremony. There is a judge that solemnizes a marriage. Now, I'm not sure. Rav Price was describing a system in Paris, because that's where he wrote this tshuva, where people are simply registering.
With the clerk.
He did not suggest that there was any ceremony. So it could very well be that if you're in a jurisdiction that has a marital ceremony, albeit secular, perhaps at that point, Price would be moda, that the bia is aldas Kiddushin Rishonim. And Rav Price brings a number of rayas which is almost against him in some ways, or weakens his point, that when there was a ceremony that turns out to be invalid, you don't say that the cohabitation creates ishus. He brings a very complicated case from the Torah. Let me just give you the case here. Here is what the Torah brings in Even HaEzer. Ruvain made his son a shaliach to give a get to his wife. He made his son be a shaliach, divorce your mother. I don't know, mother, stepmother. The son didn't want to give the get to mom unless mother gave him some money. So the son is acting the blackmail of the mother. So one of the Zakanim said to the son, listen, just give us the get. We'll hold on to the get. We'll be your shaliach to give the get. And when you want us to give the get, we'll give the get. So the son gave the get to the Zakanim by assuming that they're going to hold on to the get. After the son gave the get to the Zaken, husband comes, he's mevatel the get. He says, I hereby declare the get to be no good. And he actually cohabits with his wife. It turns out, however, that the Zakanim tricked the son. The Zakanim, or the Zaken, was actually made a shaliach to receive the get by the wife. So when the son gave the get to the Zaken, the wife was divorced, shaliach lekabbalah, and the two witnesses could testify that he was a shaliach lekabbalah, and as a result, the husband could not nullify the get because the get was already delivered. So the question was, but since he cohabited with his wife after the get was delivered, is that like Lana Ima Bapundaki, and therefore he's Makadasher with Bia, Derech Ishus, and the like? So the Torah paskins that since the husband had relations with his wife thinking they were still married from the first Kiddushin, he didn't have kavana to make a second Kiddushin. And therefore, the cohabitation will not be mechayev a get, and therefore, the svara that cohabitation can effect an ishus will not apply where the husband is under the mistake that the first marriage was a valid marriage because he thought the get wasn't delivered. Again, complicated case, but it makes the point. Now, I want to point out something. I want to deal with something that maybe is more prevalent even than civil marriages, and Rav Price does not address it, but I just want to see how he would address it. And that is the phenomenon of conservative and reform marriages, which is very common. You know, I work in Or Sameach, and obviously in Or Sameach, we have many Balei Tshuva, and many of our Balei Tshuva are children of second marriages, meaning mom got divorced and they married somebody else. And sometimes mom did not get a get from her first marriage, and not because of aguna, not because the husband was mean or whatever it was, but simply because husband and wife were not religious, so they thought a get was not necessary. They just got a civil divorce. Now, the problem is, of course, a very, very serious problem, and that is if a woman is halachically married to a Jewish man and does not receive a get, then any marriage to a second guy is adulterous. And what is even worse is the child born from that second marriage is a mamzer. And a mamzer, again, remember, this is the Lever Pashat, a kid born out of wedlock is not a mamzer. He has no disability at all. But a kid born from adultery is indeed a mamzer. And a mamzer is a Jew, and a mamzer puts on tefillin and keeps Shabbos and is counted for a minyan, but a mamzer cannot marry a regular Jewish person. A mamzer can only marry a mamzeres, or a mamzer can marry a gioris, but the marriage choices are very, very limited. So it turns out many Balei Tshuva are potentially mamzerim because they're born from mom's second marriage, where mom did not get a get from her first marriage. So it's yadua that there was a famous machlokas, at least in America, between Rav Moshe Feinstein and his older great colleague, Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin. Rav Henkin took the position that exactly as Rav Price, in fact, Rav Price in Chelek Beis quotes letters from Rav Henkin extensively because Rav Henkin agreed with him, that even if the reform ceremony was invalid because you didn't have valid witnesses, Rav Henkin maintained the cohabitation later becomes a cohabitation to create a marital bond, and therefore conservative and reform marriages require a get, which unfortunately would mean that the kids from the second marriage would have the stigma of mamzeris. Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote a series of tshuvas in which he argued that because the conservative and reform marriage were not halachically valid because you didn't have witnesses or whatever it would be, therefore a get is not required. And if a get is not required for a marriage that is not halachically valid, the child is not a mamzer. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein's psak, at least in the Baal Tshuva world that I'm a part of, is tremendous lifesaver because, otherwise maybe scores of kids, hundreds of kids might have the limitations, the very severe restrictions of mamzeris, but a very, very common mahalech is that your mother's first marriage was not valid, therefore you're not a mamzer. Now, people sometimes say, but wait a second, if my mother's first marriage was not valid, then my mother's second marriage is not valid either. That was also reformed. So I'm a mamzer. No, not true. The worst that you are is you're born out of wedlock. Okay, being born out of wedlock is not a problem, you see? In other words, the invalidity of the second marriage is not going to be an issue. It's only the invalidity of the first marriage that's important because that negates mamzeris. Now, here in Eretz Yisrael, the Rabbanut has kind of a middle of the road position, meaning lechatchila, if a woman who was married, reform or conservative, but lived with her husband, wants to remarry L'chatchila, the Rabbanut will require a get. Maybe like Rav Henkin said, because that's something you can fix. If you can receive a get, you try to give a get. But legabe, the kid being a mamzer, since there's no way to fix that if he's a mamzer, they follow Rav Moshe. In fact, I myself, the one time in my life, I had the zechus to ask Rebbe Yoshe B'Shaila, it was exactly this shaila about whether we could invalidate or understand a marriage to be invalid in order to be machshir a kid as a mamzer. And what's interesting is, in my particular case, not that I want to spend a lot of time with my particular case, but it wasn't even a reform marriage for sure. It was only a supposition. It was an Orthodox chazan who was Masada Kiddushin in a small town in Massachusetts. And the retired rabbi, who was in his 80s, testified that no Orthodox people had ever talked to the chazan, so the chazan only used reform witnesses. And therefore, Rabbi Yoshev was willing to take off mamzeris based on a second, a hearsay account of how this guy normally conducted marriages. So it's very, very clear, Lagabi mamzeris we are making. So my question is this. Rav Henkin was very strict. In fact, they say Rav Henkin on his deathbed asked Rav Moshe to be choser from two psakim. One is be choser on his psak, that reform marriages don't need a get. Be choser. The other one, nothing to do with our case, is be choser on your heter to make kiddush on Rosh Hashanah before Musaf and eat before Tekiyah Shofar. Rav Moshe has a heter that if it's a long davening, you're allowed to make kiddush and eat before Tekiyah Shofar. Rav Henkin held that was us. Two things that Rav Henkin asked Rav Moshe to be chayzer from. Rav Moshe refused to be chayzer. Okay. So the question I want to explore is that although Rav Price brings Rav Henkin in Mishnas Avraham Beis, Legabe civil marriage, he doesn't bring Rav Henkin Legabe conservative and reform marriages. In fact, nowhere in either tshuva does Rav Price address conservative or reform marriages. Laniastaiti, and again, I think it's a pretty logical jump. I believe that Rav Price would be moded to Rav Moshe that conservative and reform marriages don't need a get based on his interpretation of the Rivash's tshuva. Remember, the Rivash's tshuva was talking about a church wedding. And what did the Rivash say? That since they think they're married through the church or through Islam, their subsequent living together is not for the purpose of establishing a marital bond, but they think they're already married. The HaGaon, Rav Price says, the bia is not going to create ishus, as opposed to the civil situation where they're simply registering and they're creating their marriage through their cohabitation together. Well, it seems to me, I think it makes sense, that a church wedding is invalid, but they're living together al das, that invalid marriage. I would think kal v'chaymer by reform, where there's even more of a reason if they think it's a good marriage because it's a Jewish ceremony. So what's interesting to me is, on one hand, we have Rav Moshe, who basically says both civil marriages and reform marriages don't need a get. We have Rav Henkin, who says both civil marriages and reform marriages do need a get. And then we have Rav Price that I would suggest would say civil marriage may not need a get, at least if there's no ceremony, but conservative and reform, I'm sorry, the other way. Civil marriage needs a get, but conservative reform don't need a get, because this would fall under the Rivash's category. And that gives me a sigh of relief, because I have to tell you the truth. I was a little uneasy presenting Rabbi Price as the machber in this, because that would mean Rabbi Price would be making a lot of the Balei Tshuva mamzerim, which is a tough result. But based on the way I'm understanding it, it turns out he would be moded to Rav Moshe on conservative and reform, and Mimela, the good news would be you would no longer have a mamzeris problem, even according to Rav Price's analysis. Again, there's a lot more to talk about. He goes into all sorts of interesting questions. Let me just mention one question. I'm not going to go into all of the answers. He talks about the idea like this. The Gemara says that if a person thought he was marrying a woman that was a virgin, and it turns out she was not a virgin, that is called a mekach ta'utz. That is a marriage under mistake, and the marriage is annulled. So Rav Price asks the question, how could a naira hamurasa, a woman that's an arusa, the Torah says, if she's mezana during erusa, she gets skila. Rav Price says, as soon as she's mezana, there's no marriage anymore because it now becomes a mekach. So how could a naira hamurasa ever be chayav misa? It's a mekach. So if it was not discovered until after cohabitation, you could say that got rid of the mistake because but where it was discovered before the cohabitation, you didn't have cohabitation to validate the marriage. So how could she ever be chayav misa? How could there ever be a din of naira hamurasa? So he goes through a very, very long pilpul, and he says at the end that he knows he's spoken about a lot of things that are peripheral to the main thesis, but kachi darka shel Torah, that one idea leads to another idea. And as I say, I get a kick out of the fact that Rabbi Price said he is going to be very light in his pilpul because he knows that it gets confusing to people. So he's going to try to keep it relatively straightforward. Baruch Hashem, I'm personally grateful for that because I don't think I could have taken things at a higher level of learning. So again, I think this is just an example of what a phenomenally great Talmid Chacham he was and what a great shechus it was. Baruch Hashem, Toronto, I know from my brother, has become such a lovely community. Before Rav Price, Rav Kamenetsky, who was Rav Price's predecessor, talked about Toronto as Yerushalayim of America. And Rav Price continued that tradition for more than half a century. There are so many Rabbanim in your community and other communities who are Talmidim of him. And after so many years, his influence still continues to grow and to spread. And may the words of Torah and all of the mitzvahs and Torah that all of his Talmidim do continue to be a zechus le'iloi nishmasai. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Breitowitz. That was extremely intriguing and showing us what Mishnah of Avraham is all about, the Chachma of Rabbi Price. If anyone has any questions, I see Sam had one question. Now's a good time to ask Rabbi Breitowitz. Sam, you're muted.
So let me unmute you. Well, just practically what's going on in Israel today, many people have, I've seen writings by people who suggest that civil marriage be introduced into the Israeli society, because right now you can't get married except with Kiddushin, and allow the people to have a kind of marriage, because it would prevent mamzerim. They would, because many people who are not religious don't bother getting a divorce when they separate, and then the subsequent, and they're trying to say, well, let's put in civil marriage. They're non-religious people mostly. Anyhow, at least we won't have mamzerim. What do you think about that?
Well, okay. First of all, obviously, Rav Price could not accept that idea because he would say there would be mamzerim, so it wouldn't help you at all. But as I indicated, the Rabbanut for mamzerim does follow Rav Moshe Feinstein, who considers these marriages to be invalid. So the question then becomes a policy matter. Should we allow people to live out of wedlock in a relationship that, unless you go with Rav Price's mahalach, is considered to be pilegesh mamish, in order to avoid the mamzeris problem? No, it's a hard question because on one hand, you're giving the imprimatur on sinful behavior. I mean, if you follow the view that this is pilagshus, pilegesh is asur lehejet, and the question always becomes, to what degree should Rabbanim, should the rabbinical community give an approval or at least a tolerance for wrongdoing in order to avoid a greater avla? I can see the point. I can see the strength of allowing a civil marriage, but I think we sometimes have to worry whether this is a refuah that's worse than the makkah. there are a lot of examples where this comes up. I mean, so many examples, maybe they're not all the same. One example might be if a man and woman are living together out of wedlock, should I encourage them to go to the mikveh? Because if they're living without marriage, that's a sin, but living as a nida is a bigger sin. So should I encourage single people who are living out of wedlock to go to the mikveh to minimize their sin? Or is that a gushpanka? Is that a seal of approval? So that's a perennial issue. I think on balance, I'm not in favor of it. I think it's too much of a drastic departure from the nature of a Jewish state in which marriage and divorce at least should be governed according to Halachah. The ultimate resolution would be, I think, to make the Rabbanut more user-friendly, and as a result, people will follow the procedures. Soar, which is kind of an alternative to the Rabbanut in Eretz Israel, is trying to do exactly that. I know the Rabbanut hates Soar and is trying to destroy Soar, but I think in the long run, Soar could do a great deal of useful service in being user-friendly to a secular population and encourage them to use the marriage and divorce kahalacha.
Are there any other questions?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you
Rav
very
Breitowitz.
much. It was really a great cover, and Yitzchak Baruch, and not too many people are still remembered decades after their passing. Bezras Hashem,
That's what
his
we're
Torah
working.
should continue to permeate all of us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.